Fermentation was preservation. Flavor often came second to durability. Now imagine bread. Bread was not a side item, it was structure. In much of medieval Europe, bread was the meal. Dark, dense rye bread for peasants. Lighter wheat bread for the wealthy, because refined flour required labor, and labor required wealth. But bread was unpredictable. Milling quality varied. Stones could slip into flour. Grinding could be uneven. Sometimes the loaf was heavy enough to feel like a tool rather than food. And then there was ale. Water was not always safe. Wells were shallow. Contamination was common. Ale, weak, low alcohol, brewed locally, was often safer than water. Children drank it. Workers drank it. It was hydration disguised as mild intoxication. Now pause. There is no music here, no background lute, no cinematic slow motion. There is chewing. There is smoke in your eyes. There is a wooden spoon worn thin by generations. There is a shared bowl because plates are not universal objects yet. You eat with fingers, or with a knife you carry yourself. Forks are rare in much of medieval Europe until later centuries. Hygiene is relative. Hands are wiped on cloth, or on tunic. And yet, this is not misery in the theatrical sense. It is normal. That is what makes it powerful. No one at that table is thinking they live in hardship. They are thinking they are eating. Because food, in the Middle Ages, was not cuisine. It was continuity. And tomorrow, it will likely taste the same. Before we add more food to the table, we need to remove some. Because in the Middle Ages, you did not only eat according to harvest, you ate according to heaven. The medieval calendar was not just seasons and saints. It was restriction. It was rhythm imposed not by appetite, but by doctrine. And doctrine had opinions about what you could chew. In much of medieval Europe, under the authority of the Church, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, fasting was not optional spirituality. It was routine, structured, mandatory. There were days without meat, many of them. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, vigils, ember days. Periods where animal flesh disappeared from the table, not because livestock had died, but because the soul required discipline. The logic was theological. The effect was nutritional. For peasants, who rarely saw much meat anyway, fasting blurred into normalcy. Removing what you seldom had did not create drama. But for wealthier households, fasting reshaped entire kitchens. No beef, no pork, no poultry. Fish became the solution. And suddenly, rivers mattered more. Coastal regions adapted easily. Inland communities traded, salted, transported. Herring traveled. Cod traveled. Salt preserved protein across distance. Entire economies shifted to meet the demand of religious abstinence. Strange, if you pause long enough to notice it. An invisible authority influencing what ends up in your bowl. But medieval people did not separate religion from daily life the way modern societies often do. Faith was infrastructure. It governed sleep, marriage, work, and yes, chewing. And fasting was not always mild. Lent alone could stretch 40 days. That is 40 days of modified eating. 40 days where butter might disappear, where eggs were forbidden, where milk was avoided in stricter observance. Imagine a winter already low in variety. Now remove dairy. Meals narrowed. Grain, fish, legumes, oil, if available. Almond milk sometimes replaced cow's milk in wealthier kitchens. Not because almonds were abundant, but because rules demanded creativity. And creativity thrives under restriction. Medieval cookbooks from later centuries, particularly in France and Italy, show remarkable adaptability. Complex sauces without meat stock, thickened broths using bread, seasonings layered to compensate for absence. But remember, cookbooks represent elites. The majority did not own manuscripts. They owned pots, and fasting for them was simpler. Less fat, more porridge, a thinner stew. There is something psychologically interesting here. When scarcity is normal, ritual scarcity does not shock. It blends. But fasting was not only about removal, it was about awareness. You were supposed to feel it. The slight ache in your stomach during Lent was not failure. It was participation. It was imitation of Christ's suffering. Hunger became symbolic currency. Now consider this carefully. In a society where many people already lived close to hunger, the spiritualization of hunger changes its meaning. If you are hungry because crops failed, that is tragedy. If you are hungry because God wills discipline, that is virtue. The physical sensation is similar. The narrative is different. And narratives matter. They make endurance tolerable. They frame monotony as purpose. So on a cold Friday evening in 13th century England, or 14th century France, or somewhere within the Holy Roman Empire, a family gathers around a modest meal of bread and salted fish. There is no outrage. There is structure. Children grow up knowing this rhythm. Feast and fast. Abundance and restraint. The year swings like a pendulum between indulgence and denial. And feast days did exist. When fasting ended, especially at Easter, the return of rich foods was dramatic. Butter, eggs, roasted meats, pastries in wealthier regions, sugar, if you were fortunate enough to access imported luxury. Contrast intensified pleasure. Deprivation sharpened flavor. But even feasts were temporary spikes in a landscape of repetition. You did not live in feast. You visited it. Then you returned to grain. And all of this, the rules, the substitutions, the salted fish, the almond milk experiments in aristocratic kitchens, existed without refrigeration, without global trade networks as we know them, without modern understanding of vitamins or protein balance. They ate by tradition. They fasted by command. They endured by normalization. Now, pause again. There is no dramatic music swelling, just a spoon scraping the bottom of a wooden bowl. Tomorrow might be a feast, or it might be another fasting day. Either way, the fire will need tending. And hunger, whether holy or practical, will sit quietly at the edge of the table. If you truly want to understand how people ate in the Middle Ages, you need to stop imagining castles and start imagining mud, not cinematic mud, not romanticized countryside bathed in golden light. Real mud. Thick, adhesive, stubborn earth that clings to your boots and defines your horizon. Because most medieval people did not dine beneath banners. They ate within reach of the fields they worked, and the fields dictated everything. A peasant's meal was not an event. It was an interruption between tasks. The day began before sunrise, not because of discipline, but because daylight was currency. You worked while you could see. That meant tending crops, repairing fences, managing livestock, carrying water, cutting wood. Physical labor was not exercise, it was survival mathematics. Calories burned had to be replaced. Not luxuriously, just sufficiently. Breakfast, if it existed distinctly at all, was modest and often cold. Leftover bread. A large iron pot hung over the central hearth, suspended by a hook or resting over embers. Into that pot went grain, barley, oats, or rye, depending on region. And whatever vegetables the season allowed: cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, sometimes peas or beans. If a bit of bacon fat was available, it might be rendered into the mixture for flavor and calories. If not, herbs from nearby land might provide a faint suggestion of complexity. The pot did not empty completely each night. It was replenished, extended, diluted, thickened again. It evolved slowly, absorbing ingredients as days passed, becoming a culinary timeline of the household's fortune. There is something almost philosophical about that, a meal that remembers yesterday while accommodating today. Meat, for peasants, was occasional rather than routine. Pigs were valuable, but slaughtering one was a serious decision. Preservation was crucial. Once killed, an animal had to be salted, smoked, or dried to prevent waste. Fresh meat was a temporary abundance followed by careful rationing. Chickens provided eggs more reliably than they provided flesh. Cows were more valuable alive for milk and labor than dead for beef. Every animal represented utility beyond taste. And monotony was not accidental. It was structural. Imagine eating variations of grain-based stews for weeks, months, years. Imagine flavor existing within narrow boundaries, defined by what grows nearby and what survives winter. There were no imported spices for most people. No citrus brightness cutting through richness. Salt was precious. Sweetness was rare and usually tied to honey, if bees were kept successfully. But here is the part that modern imagination often misses. Monotony did not necessarily equal dissatisfaction. Human expectation calibrates itself to environment. If you have never tasted chocolate, you do not crave chocolate. If your neighbors eat the same porridge, your meal does not feel inferior, it feels normal. The bowl in your hands was not judged against possibility, it was judged against sufficiency, and sufficiency was fragile. A poor harvest did not mean mild inconvenience. It meant reducing portions. It meant stretching grain with more water. It meant grinding acorns into flour in desperate seasons. It meant watching children eat first and adults calculating what remained. Medieval famine was not constant, but when it arrived, it rewrote daily life with brutal clarity. The line between simple diet and dangerous scarcity was thinner than we might comfortably admit. Even during stable years, nutrition was uneven. Protein intake fluctuated. Vitamins were poorly understood, though leafy greens in summer and preserved vegetables in winter provided some balance. Fermented foods helped in subtle ways. Cabbage, especially when preserved, carried communities quietly through colder months. Now picture the physical act of eating. There are no individual plates for many households. A shared wooden bowl sits at the center. Bread, thick and coarse, might serve as both utensil and sponge. You tear, dip, scoop. Your hands are rarely pristine. Water for washing is limited and prioritized for necessity, not presentation. Knives are personal tools, carried on belts. Forks are still rare in much of medieval Europe, spreading slowly through wealthier circles. Meals are eaten near the hearth, because heat concentrates there. Smoke drifts horizontally, before finding escape through roof openings or primitive chimneys. Your clothes carry that smell permanently. So does the food. Everything tastes faintly of firewood. And yet, there is conversation. There is shared silence. There is the quiet sound of chewing layered over crackling embers. The peasant's bowl is not dramatic. It is not tragic in the theatrical sense. It is repetitive. It is steady. It is designed not for pleasure, but for persistence. Tomorrow, the same pot will hang over the same fire. Tomorrow, grain will meet water again. And if the harvest holds, if the animals survive winter, if disease stays distant, the bowl will remain filled. Not richly, not extravagantly, but adequately. In the Middle Ages, for most people, that was enough. Now, let's leave the mud for a moment. Not because it disappears, but because somewhere above it, literally and socially, another version of medieval eating exists. If the peasant's bowl was about survival, the castle table was about display. Not merely nourishment, but message. not simply eating, but signaling. Because in the Middle Ages, food was power you could chew. Walk with me into the lower levels of a castle kitchen in 14th century France or England. The air is hotter here, thicker, louder. Multiple hearths burn at once. Iron spits rotate slowly over open flame, turned by servants whose arms ache long before the meat finishes roasting. Large cauldrons bubble. Knives strike wood rhythmically. The scale is different. The labor is invisible upstairs. But here, it is constant. A noble household under the Plantagenets in England or the Valois dynasty in France does not cook one pot of pottage for the day. It orchestrates courses. There are specialists, a cook for sauces, a baker, a butcher, a scullion washing and scraping, a steward overseeing inventory because food in a castle is logistics as much as luxury, and logistics determines hierarchy. The lord does not eat the same bread as the servant. Wheat flour, finely sifted, becomes white bread. Lighter, softer, more expensive because refinement requires time and labor. Dark rye bread descends the social ladder. Even grain carries status. Now imagine a feast. Spices enter the room like whispers from faraway places. Pepper from India, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, imported through trade networks that cross continents. Expensive not only because of distance, but because of risk and intermediaries. To season heavily is to demonstrate wealth, not culinary subtlety. Modern palates might find some medieval noble dishes overwhelming. Sweet and savory combined boldly. Sauces thickened with bread and almonds. Sugar used in meat preparations. But subtlety was not the goal. Impact was color mattered too. Food was dyed with saffron for yellow, parsley for green, sometimes even crushed insects for red. A dish that looked vibrant was admired. Appearance preceded taste, but beneath spectacle lies structure. Even feasts followed rules. Seating reflected rank. The best cuts of meat moved upward. Lower status guests received less desirable portions. Servants often ate separately after the hall quieted. Hierarchy did not dissolve at the table. It sharpened. And yet, excess had limits. Preservation still governed reality. Fresh fruit was seasonal. Meat had to be salted or smoked if not consumed quickly. Ice storage existed in colder regions, but refrigeration as we know it did not. Waste was dangerous, not morally, but practically. A poorly managed larder could endanger a household's survival through winter. So behind every lavish display stood careful accounting. Barrels of salted fish, racks of dried herbs, cellars storing wine and ale, granaries locked and monitored. Famine did not spare nobles entirely. It simply reached them later. Now listen carefully. The castle feast was not daily life. It was punctuation. Most noble meals, outside major celebrations, were more restrained, though still varied compared to peasant diets. There might be multiple courses, yes, but not constant extravagance. Stews, pies encasing meat for preservation, fresh bread, cheese, wine, controlled abundance rather than reckless indulgence. And fasting still applied. The same church that shaped peasant meals also shaped noble tables. On fasting days, kitchens adapted. Fish replaced meat. Almond milk substituted dairy. Creativity thrived within restriction. But unlike peasants, nobles had options. And options are power. Now imagine sitting at the lower end of a great hall bench, watching platters pass you by toward the elevated table. You smell roasted meat before you taste it. You see spice before you touch it. The choreography of service reminds you exactly where you stand. Food in the castle was never neutral. It reinforced order. It reminded everyone present who commanded land, who commanded labor, who commanded grain. And yet, when the candles burned low and servants cleared scraps into baskets, when the hall emptied and only embers remained, even the Lord would wake the next morning needing bread. Because beneath spectacle, beneath hierarchy, beneath saffron and silver goblets, the body remains democratic. It requires sustenance. Even kings must chew, and tomorrow the kitchens will ignite again. If you strip away the feasts, the spices, the roasted spectacle, and the romantic paintings, what remains at the center of medieval eating is something far less dramatic and far more powerful: bread and ale. Not as accessories, as structure. Bread was not a side dish. It was not something placed politely beside the real food. In much of medieval Europe, bread was the meal. It was the foundation upon which everything else rested, nutritionally and socially. Remove bread, and the entire system begins to wobble. Imagine a village oven, communal, built from clay and stone, radiating heat long after the fire has burned down. Families prepare their dough at home, coarse flour ground from rye, barley, or oats, depending on what grows in the soil beneath their feet. Then bring it to the oven to bake. The flour is not refined to modern standards. Bran remains. Texture is dense. The color leans dark, sometimes almost gray. White bread exists, yes, but whiteness is labor. It requires sifting, re-sifting, removing the coarse elements. It requires time and manpower. And time, in the Middle Ages, is wealth. So the color of your bread quietly announces your position in the world. Dark bread fills stomachs. White bread signals status. And yet, regardless of color, bread is fragile in its own way. Grain harvests determine quantity. A poor summer means smaller loaves. A damp harvest risks mold. Ergot, a fungus that infects rye, can contaminate flour and cause illness, even hallucinations, though medieval people would not understand the biological mechanism. They would only understand that sometimes, after eating, something feels wrong. Still, bread persists. It is eaten fresh when possible. When stale, it becomes something else. It thickens soups. It lines trenchers. Thick slices used as edible plates in wealthier households. It absorbs grease and sauce, then is eaten or given to the poor. Nothing wastes easily in a world without surplus. Now, take a sip of ale. Not modern beer. Not something cold and carbonated. Medieval ale is often cloudy, mildly alcoholic, brewed locally and consumed quickly because it does not age well. It is safer than much of the available water, which may be drawn from shallow wells vulnerable to contamination. So ale becomes hydration, not indulgence. Children drink it. Laborers drink it. Monks brew it. Monasteries, in particular, become centers of brewing expertise. Within the walls of places like those governed by the Benedictine order, brewing evolves with careful attention, not because monks sought intoxication, but because fermentation was practical, predictable, and, importantly, storable for short periods. Ale provides calories too. In a labor-intensive society, liquid calories matter. A worker in the fields might consume several pints across a day, not to escape reality, but to maintain it. Bread and ale form a partnership. Solid and liquid. Chew and swallow. They are the architecture of survival. And architecture is rarely glamorous. Pause here. Imagine the rhythm of chewing dense bread after hours of field work. Your jaw works slowly. The texture resists slightly before yielding. You dip it into a thin stew or into ale to soften it. You swallow, not with delight, but with intention. This is fuel. Fuel keeps you standing. Standing keeps you working. Working keeps the grain growing. The cycle is circular and unforgiving. Now, think about storage again, because survival depends on it. Grain must be dried properly before storage. Too much moisture invites rot. Too little protection invites rodents. Granaries are guarded carefully. Theft of grain is not minor crime. It is interference with community survival. Milling, too, becomes central. The village mill is not merely a building. It is an economic hub. Peasants often owe a portion of their grain to the miller or to the local lord for the right to grind it. The act of turning wheat into flour is mechanical but political. Control the mill, and you influence who eats. And bread prices can destabilize regions. Centuries later, during periods like those leading into the French Revolution, bread shortages would ignite unrest. But even in earlier medieval periods, fluctuations in grain supply ripple outward. When bread grows scarce, tension rises quietly before it becomes visible. Because bread is not luxury, it is expectation. Ale follows similar logic. Brewing requires grain as well, so when harvests fail, both solid and liquid staples shrink. Diet narrows. Bodies thin. Energy declines. Productivity falls. And the entire structure strains. Yet when harvests are good, when granaries are full, when ovens bake continuously and barrels ferment steadily, there is a sense of quiet stability. Not celebration, not indulgence, stability. And stability in the Middle Ages is a gift. Now picture evening again. The sun lowers behind fields that determined your entire menu. Smoke rises from chimneys unevenly. Somewhere inside a small timber house, bread rests on a wooden board. A jug of ale sits beside it. A family gathers, not in ceremony, but in repetition. They tear, they dip, they drink. No spices from distant lands. No dramatic feast. Just grain transformed by fire and time. And tomorrow, if weather allows and labor continues, it will be the same. Bread, ale, and the quiet persistence of survival disguised as dinner. Now let's talk about meat. Not the dramatic version first. Not the roasted boar paraded into a great hall. Not the theatrical carving knife glinting in candlelight. Let's talk about desire. Because in the Middle Ages, meat was not just food. It was aspiration. Protein, in a world of grain-heavy diets, represented strength, status, and sometimes legality. And legality matters here more than hunger. Imagine you are a peasant in 14th century England, under the rule of the Plantagenets. You live near a forest, thick with deer. You can see them at dawn, silent and alert, stepping carefully through mist. You are hungry. Your children are thin from a long winter. You cannot hunt them. Not because you lack a bow. Not because you lack skill. But because the forest belongs to the crown. Forest law is strict. Deer are not simply animals. They are property. To kill one without permission is not merely poaching. It is theft from authority. And theft from authority carries consequences. So meat becomes political. The right to hunt, to claim animal flesh from land, reinforces hierarchy. Nobles hunt. Kings hunt. Hunting becomes sport layered over necessity. Falconry becomes art. Dogs are trained. Horns sound through wooded estates. Meanwhile, villagers trap rabbits quietly. They raise pigs when possible. They rely on what is legally accessible. Now step into a peasant yard. Pigs root near the house. Chickens scratch in dirt. A cow stands tethered, more valuable alive for milk and labor than dead for beef. Livestock are walking investments. Killing one is not casual. It is a calculation. When a pig is slaughtered, often in late autumn, it becomes an event. Not spectacle like a feast, but coordinated labor. Nothing is wasted. Meat is salted. Fat is rendered into lard. Intestines become sausage casing. Bones flavor broths. Even blood becomes pudding in some regions. Preservation dictates timing. Cold weather helps prevent spoilage. Salt draws moisture from flesh, extending survival through winter. Smokehouses transform cuts into something durable. The flavor changes, sharper, deeper. But durability matters more than delicacy. Fresh meat is temporary. Salted meat is strategy. And yet, fresh meat does appear. Chickens might be slaughtered for special occasions. A lamb might be eaten in spring. Fish, especially in coastal or river-rich regions, offer more frequent protein. Herring, cod, eel, these shape diets significantly, especially during fasting periods. In fact, fish becomes so central that entire trade routes depend on it. The North Sea teems with herring, preserved and transported inland. Salted cod travels astonishing distances. Protein moves where cattle cannot. But taste is still different from expectation. Imagine biting into salted pork after weeks of grain and vegetables. The intensity would feel overwhelming. The fat coats your mouth. The salt lingers. It is not subtle. It is not refined. It is powerful. And power is felt physically. Now, let's climb back to the castle briefly. Hunting for nobles is layered with symbolism. A deer brought down is not only dinner, it is demonstration. Control over land, over forest, over life. Feasts featuring venison or wild boar communicate dominance. The animal arrives whole, sometimes even redressed in its hide for theatrical presentation. But beneath the spectacle, the same preservation rules apply. Meat must be consumed quickly or transformed into something that lasts. Kitchens move with urgency. Salt cellars are guarded carefully. Spices mask not rot, as myth sometimes claims, but intensity. Strong flavors complement strong preservation. There is another layer here, seasonality. Animals are fattest at certain times of year. Slaughter schedules align with practical realities. Winter feeding costs resources. Sometimes it is more efficient to slaughter livestock in autumn than sustain them through months of scarcity. So meat supply fluctuates. Summer might bring milk and cheese in abundance. Autumn brings slaughter and preservation. Winter brings reliance on what was stored correctly. Spring tests endurance. Protein is not constant. It arrives in waves, and waves define anticipation. Now imagine sitting at a wooden table after a day of labor. Someone places before you a small portion of salted pork mixed into pottage. It is not a large piece. It does not dominate the bowl, but its presence transforms the entire meal. Flavor spreads outward into grain and vegetable, altering everything. You chew slowly, you notice. Meat, in much of medieval daily life, was not background. It was punctuation. And punctuation stands out precisely because it interrupts monotony. Tomorrow may return to grain and cabbage. The memory of pork lingers. In that sense, meat becomes psychological as much as nutritional. It reassures. It signals survival through winter. It marks feast days. It distinguishes ordinary evenings from exceptional ones. But always, it remains tied to land, law, and labor. Because in the Middle Ages, even what you chew reminds you where you stand. Before flavor, before hierarchy, before feast or famine, there is fire. And fire in the Middle Ages is not a button you press. It is a responsibility, a presence, a living thing inside the house that must be fed, controlled, respected, and feared in equal measure. Imagine stepping into a medieval kitchen, whether in a peasant cottage or in the service wing of a castle. The first thing you notice is not the food. It is the smoke. Even with chimneys, which became more common later in the medieval period. Ventilation is imperfect. In earlier homes, smoke escapes through a hole in the roof, or simply lingers until it finds its way out. Your eyes adjust slowly. Your lungs adapt, whether they want to or not. The ceiling darkens over years, layers of soot building silently above generations of meals. The hearth is the center of the house, not metaphorically, structurally. In a peasant dwelling, the fire often occupies the middle of the single main room. Cooking, heating, light, all originate here. You do not go to the kitchen. You live around it. Cooking technology is simple, but simplicity does not mean ease. An iron pot hangs from a hook over the flames. The height can be adjusted slightly to control heat, but precision is relative. There are no thermometers, no timers. Cooking depends on instinct, experience, and observation. You watch the way liquid moves. You listen to the sound of boiling. You smell when something shifts from edible to burned. Bread, in many rural households, is not baked daily at home because ovens are expensive to build and maintain. Instead, communal ovens dominate villages. But flatbreads or smaller loaves might be baked in ashes or on heated stones. Texture varies. Consistency is not guaranteed. In castles, the kitchen becomes an industrial operation. Large hearths line stone walls. Spits rotate entire animals. Assistants turn them manually or through simple mechanical devices powered by weight, or even small animals like dogs running in wheels. Cauldrons large enough to feed dozens simmer continuously. The heat is intense. The floor is slick. The noise is constant. And yet, even here, cooking is not scientific in the modern sense. Recipes, when written, are often vague. Boil until done. Add spices as needed. Measurements are intuitive. Handfuls, pinches, ladles. Precision lives in the cook's memory, not on parchment. Utensils are minimal. Wooden spoons, iron knives, clay or metal pots. Mortars and pestles for grinding herbs and spices. Sieves for straining sauces in wealthier kitchens. The tools are durable, but few. Now think about refrigeration again. There isn't any, so cooking becomes a race against time. Meat must be prepared quickly after slaughter unless preserved. Dairy spoils fast. Fish demands urgency. Even vegetables once harvested begin their quiet decay. Fire becomes both creator and protector. It transforms raw grain into digestible bread. It turns tough meat into something chewable. It sterilizes, to a degree, through heat. But it also consumes wood rapidly. Fuel is a constant concern. Gathering firewood is labor. In regions where forests are controlled by nobles, even wood can carry legal restrictions. Nothing about cooking is passive. It requires planning. Now imagine winter. The days are short. The air is sharp. Inside the house, the hearth burns longer, not only for food, but for survival. Meals cluster around warmth. Smoke thickens because doors remain closed. Windows, if present, are small and inefficient. The fire becomes companion. You stare into it while stirring pottage. You adjust logs carefully to maintain steady heat. Too much flame burns the bottom of the pot. Too little leaves grain undercooked and stomachs unsettled. There is a rhythm to medieval cooking that modern convenience has erased. You cannot rush fermentation. You cannot instantly heat water. You cannot microwave leftovers. Time is embedded in every step. Grinding grain takes time. Kneading dough takes time. Raising bread takes time. Stewing takes time. Smoking meat takes days. Salting takes patience. Even fetching water takes effort. Cooking is not separate from life. It is life. And because of that, meals are shaped by labor long before they reach the table. When you taste bread, you are tasting harvest. milling, kneading, baking. When you sip ale, you are tasting malting, fermenting, waiting. When you eat stew, you are tasting chopping, tending, watching. Modern kitchens hide process behind appliances. Medieval kitchens display it openly. Now picture a quiet evening. The fire has burned low. The main meal has been eaten. A pot remains hanging, embers glowing beneath. Someone adds water, perhaps a handful of grain, extending tomorrow's meal before sleep. The house smells permanently of smoke and cooked onions. There is no stainless steel shine. There is soot. There is heat. There is repetition. And through repetition, skill develops. Cooks, whether peasant women managing households or professional chefs serving nobility, carry knowledge that is rarely written but deeply practiced. They know how to stretch ingredients, how to mask slight spoilage before it becomes dangerous, how to thicken thin broth, how to manage flame without burning dinner or the house. Fire is not decoration, it is negotiation. And every meal in the Middle Ages begins with that negotiation. Between wood and flame, between raw and cooked, between hunger and heat. Tomorrow, the fire will need to be lit again. And everything begins there. Now that the fire has done its work, now that the bread is torn and the stew has thickened, we need to talk about something quieter. Not the food itself, but the act of eating together. Because in the Middle Ages, meals were rarely solitary. Eating alone was unusual unless circumstance forced it. Food was shared not only because plates were limited, but because survival itself was collective. And when something is collective, it becomes ritual. Let's begin with the table. In many peasant homes, there isn't a permanent dining table as we imagine it. There may be a wooden board placed over trestles, benches instead of individual chairs. The arrangement is practical, movable, functional. Space inside a small timber house is valuable. Furniture adapts. Bowls are shared, not metaphorically, literally. A large wooden bowl might sit between 2 or 3 people. You eat from your side. You do not reach greedily across. There are rules, even if they are unwritten. Bread becomes your utensil. You dip carefully. You tear small portions. You avoid touching what others will eat. Personal space exists, but differently. Knives are personal tools. Many carry their own, attached to belts. Forks, as a common utensil, are still rare in much of medieval Europe until the later centuries. In earlier periods, fingers do the work. Spoons exist, usually wooden, sometimes metal in wealthier settings. But eating is tactile. You feel the food. Texture matters because your hands confirm it before your mouth does. Now imagine the soundscape. Low conversation. The scrape of wood against wood. A cough from lingering smoke. The soft crackle of fire in the background. No background music. No clinking of porcelain. No hum of refrigeration. Eating is not rushed. But it is not leisurely in the modern sense either. Time is measured by daylight, not by schedule. A meal happens when labor pauses. It ends when labor resumes or darkness falls. And then there are manners. Yes, there were manners. Contrary to the myth of universal medieval chaos, table etiquette developed early, especially among the nobility. Manuals on behavior began appearing in later medieval centuries, outlining expectations. Do not stuff your mouth too full. Do not wipe greasy hands on the tablecloth. Do not blow your nose into your fingers and then reach back into the communal dish. These instructions may sound basic, but they reveal something important. Even in a world without modern sanitation standards, there was awareness of courtesy, of order, of shared boundaries. In noble households, hierarchy sharpened ritual. Seating mattered deeply. The high table elevated the lord, and distinguished guests. Proximity to power was physical. Courses were served in waves. Servants moved with choreographed precision. Napkins exist. Hand-washing before and after meals, especially among elites, was common, often with basins brought to the table. Cleanliness was not absent. It was contextual. Spices were expensive. Linen was valuable. Silverware, where present, was guarded carefully. Etiquette reinforced status. Knowing how to eat correctly signaled belonging to a certain class. But even among peasants, shared meals reinforced bonds. A family gathered around a hearth after a day in the fields experiences something steady, predictable. The act of sitting, of dividing bread fairly, of passing the bowl, becomes reassurance. In a world where harvests can fail and illness can arrive without warning, routine becomes comfort. Now imagine a winter evening. Wind presses against the walls. The door rattles slightly in its frame. Inside, the fire offers warmth and light. A pot is set down between family members. Steam rises faintly. Hands reach in rhythm. There is no abundance, no dramatic carving of roast, just measured portions. But conversation flows about the field, about a neighbor's illness, about the coming market day. Stories are told. Worries are shared. Silence settles comfortably when needed. Eating is not entertainment. It is reinforcement. Reinforcement of family, of rank, of expectation. Even prayer often frames the meal. A brief moment of thanks to God for provision, for survival through another day. Faith and food intertwine seamlessly. You do not separate the two. Gratitude is part of digestion. And then there are guests. Hospitality matters deeply in medieval society. To offer bread and ale to a traveler is not extravagance. It is duty. Refusing hospitality carries moral weight. In a world of long roads and uncertain safety, a shared meal can mean protection. So food becomes social currency. You may not have gold, but you have bread. And offering it binds you, however briefly, to another person. Now consider something subtle. Because bowls are shared and portions are visible, fairness is visible too. If someone takes more than their share, it is noticed immediately. Social pressure regulates behavior quietly. Community enforces balance long before formal systems intervene. Eating together teaches restraint. It teaches awareness. It teaches place. When the meal ends, leftovers are managed carefully. Bread is wrapped. The pot is adjusted for tomorrow. The fire is banked to preserve embers overnight if possible. Nothing is dramatic. Everything is intentional. And as darkness deepens, the house settles into quiet. Tomorrow, the same bench will hold the same bodies. The same bowl will sit between them. And the ritual will repeat, not because it is exciting, but because repetition is stability. In the Middle Ages, to eat was not merely to consume. We have talked about bread, about stew, about shared bowls and ritual. But medieval eating cannot be understood without confronting its shadow. Hunger, not the modern inconvenience of skipping lunch, not the mild irritation before dinner. Real hunger, the kind that stretches across weeks, across seasons, across entire regions. In the Middle Ages, food security was fragile. Agriculture depended heavily on weather, soil fertility, labor stability, and political peace. A single failed harvest could ripple outward into catastrophe. 2 failed harvests could mean famine, and famine was not rare. Imagine late summer. The crops should be nearly ready. The wheat should stand golden in the fields. But instead, heavy rain has rotted portions of the grain. Or an early frost has blackened the stalks. Or war has trampled farmland under marching army. The yield is lower than expected. At first, people adjust quietly. Bread becomes thinner. Pottage becomes more watery. Meat, already rare for peasants, disappears entirely from daily meals. Grain stores are rationed carefully. No one says the word famine yet, but everyone feels it. As autumn deepens, anxiety grows. Winter looms. Winter always looms. Medieval Europe experienced one of its most devastating famines in the early 14th century, the Great Famine. Relentless rains destroyed crops across northern Europe. Livestock died. Prices soared. Grain became inaccessible to the poor. But even outside major historical events, localized famine was part of life. When food grows scarce, diets shift toward desperation. People consume grains meant for seed. They eat livestock that would otherwise breed for next year. They forage more aggressively. Wild roots, bark, acorns. Some grind acorns into flour after leaching bitterness. Others mix straw or ground legumes into bread to stretch supplies. Livestock died. Prices soared. Grain became inaccessible to the poor. But even outside major historical events, localized famine was part of life. When food grows scarce, diets shift toward desperation. People consume grains meant for seed. They eat livestock that would otherwise breed for next year. They forage more aggressively. Wild roots, bark, acorns. Some grind acorns into flour after leaching bitterness. Others mix straw or ground legumes into bread to stretch supplies. Bread becomes darker, heavier, less nourishing. Sometimes it becomes dangerous. Ergot fungus, which infects rye, could contaminate grain stores. Consuming ergot-infected bread caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Medieval people did not understand the chemistry, only the suffering. Now imagine the bowl on the table. Smaller portions, more silence. Children cry more easily. Adults eat less, so the young can eat slightly more. Hunger changes temperament. It sharpens edges. It makes patience thinner. And yet, even in famine, social structure remains. Lords may open grain stores, or they may hoard them. Monasteries sometimes distribute bread to the poor. Charity is not merely kindness, it is spiritual obligation. Feeding the hungry is tied to salvation. But resources are finite. In cities, prices spike quickly. Urban populations are particularly vulnerable because they rely on purchased grain rather than direct harvest. Bakers may reduce loaf size. Markets become tense spaces. Theft increases. Hunger changes morality. Not instantly. Not universally. But gradually. There are documented instances, rare but real, of people resorting to eating horses, dogs, even worse in extreme cases. These stories are not the norm, but they exist at the outer edges of famine. What is more common is quiet suffering, edema from protein deficiency, weakened immune systems, greater vulnerability to disease. Hunger does not merely empty the stomach. It weakens the body against everything else. And then comes disease. Malnourished populations are more susceptible to outbreaks. In the 14th century, famine preceded the arrival of the Black Death in many regions. While plague was caused by bacteria, weakened bodies had fewer defenses. When the bowl is empty, the entire structure of life trembles. Now contrast that with a good harvest year. Abundance brings relief. Not extravagance, just relief. Bread thickens again. Stew becomes richer. There is enough to store properly for winter. Anxiety softens. In the Middle Ages, eating was not stable across years. It oscillated. Between enough and not enough. Between hope and fear. And because of that, food was never taken lightly. A full bowl carried emotional weight. It represented survival through uncertainty. It meant that, at least for now, winter would not be catastrophic. Imagine a mother dividing bread during a lean year. Her knife moves carefully. She pretends not to notice her own hunger. She makes portions appear equal, even if hers is slightly smaller. She does not dramatize the sacrifice. It is simply understood. Hunger teaches calculation. It teaches memory. Communities remember bad years. They store stories of them. They warn children about waste. They pray for mild weather. They watch the sky closely during planting and harvest. Modern abundance has insulated many of us from that constant vigilance. Medieval people lived inside it. Every meal carried the memory of potential loss. Every harvest carried the possibility of failure. And so we truly ate. There was gratitude deeper than flavor. Gratitude that the grain had grown, that the weather had held, that the livestock had survived, that the bowl was not empty tonight. To understand medieval eating is to understand that hunger was never far away. It waited at the edge of every season, and sometimes it stepped inside. It was to belong. After everything, the fire, the smoke, the bread, the rituals, the hunger, the fear, we arrive at something quieter, a realization. To eat in the Middle Ages was not simply to consume food. It was to participate in a fragile system of survival. Modern eating is often about choice, preference, convenience, identity. You choose what you feel like eating. You experiment. You reject ingredients. You debate flavor profiles. For most medieval people, eating was not about preference. It was about availability. You ate what the land produced, what the season allowed, what your status permitted, what your labor earned. And within those limits, you found rhythm. Think about the medieval year as a circle, not a line. Spring meant lean stores but fresh green. Summer brought herbs, some fruits, the promise of grain. Autumn was harvest, the most critical moment of the year. Winter meant reliance on what had been preserved: salted meat, dried peas, hardened cheese, stored grain. Every meal was seasonal, not because it was fashionable, because it was unavoidable. There were no strawberries in winter, no fresh lettuce in frost, no imported avocados crossing oceans in refrigerated containers. Trade existed, yes, spices from the east, wine from southern regions. But these luxuries were reserved primarily for elite. For the majority, diet was local, hyper-local. What grew within walking distance defined your flavor world. And that flavor world was narrower than ours, but it was also deeply known. People knew their grain. They knew how it smelled when freshly milled. They knew the difference between a good loaf and a poorly risen one. They recognized the subtle sourness of ale turning. They understood how long cabbage could last in storage before softening. Knowledge of food was practical and embodied. It lived in hands. Now imagine sitting in a peasant house at dusk. The bowl is modest. Perhaps a thick pottage of barley and peas, a crust of rye bread, maybe a bit of onion. If fortune smiles, a small piece of pork preserved from autumn slaughter. It is not colorful. It is not plated. It is not aesthetic. But it is sustaining. And sustaining was enough. Contrast that with a feast in a noble hall. Long tables, candles flickering against stone walls, roasted meats carried in procession, spiced wine poured generously, dishes layered with symbolic meaning, peacocks redressed in their feathers for spectacle, elaborate pies hiding smaller birds within. Here, food becomes theater. Power is displayed through abundance. Control over land becomes visible through what is served. Spices imported through vast trade networks signal wealth and reach. Cinnamon, cloves, pepper, tiny fragments of distant worlds, crushed into sauces to prove connection and status. Yet even here, beneath spectacle, the same truth remains. Food equals survival. Even kings depend on harvests. Even castles fall if supply lines fail. The difference lies in buffer, in how many bad years one can survive before the system collapses. For peasants, one failed harvest could mean starvation. For nobility, it might mean tighter management, higher taxes, strained stores. But survival remained more likely. So, what did it really mean to eat in the Middle Ages? It meant living inside uncertainty. It meant understanding that food required land, labor, weather, animals, and cooperation. It meant accepting monotony, the same grains, the same textures, the same flavors. Not because imagination was absent, but because stability mattered more than novelty. It meant sharing, rarely alone, usually from the same pot, within sight of others who depended on the same harvest. It meant respecting bread. Bread was not side dish. It was foundation. In many regions, the very word for food was synonymous with bread. To waste it bordered on moral failure. It meant patience. You could not rush grain to grow. You could not rush fermentation. You could not rush cure. Time was not an inconvenience, it was an ingredient. It also meant resilience. Medieval people adapted constantly. They experimented within constraints. They learned preservation techniques, salting, drying, smoking, fermenting, that allowed food to stretch across months. They rotated crops gradually, improved tools slowly, shared knowledge across generations. They were not ignorant of flavor. They simply lived in a world where flavor bowed to survival. And perhaps the most important truth: eating was never isolated from the rest of life. Religion shaped fasting days, and there were many. In Christian Europe, fasting periods limited meat consumption for large portions of the year. Fish replaced flesh. Oil replaced animal fat in some regions. Food followed the liturgical calendar as much as the agricultural one. Work shaped appetite. Status shaped portion. Weather shaped mood. Everything was connected. Now, step back. Close your eyes and imagine the medieval table one last time. No electricity. No packaged goods. No refrigerators humming in the background. Just firelight. Wood. Steam rising from a shared pot. Hands reaching carefully. A quiet prayer. A measured portion. Relief that tonight, at least, there is enough. To eat in the Middle Ages was to exist at the edge of nature's mercy. It was to understand, deeply, instinctively, that food was not guaranteed. And because it was not guaranteed, it mattered. Every crumb, every harvest, every bowl, that is what it meant.